They say timing is everything in life. If that's true, then my timing has always been absolutely terrible. Take Tuesday, March 15th, for instance. I got fired at noon sharp, right after the quarterly budget meeting where I'd presented 3 months of cost-saving measures that would have saved the company $2 million annually. My boss, Janet Morrison, called me into her glass-walled office with that look people get when they're about to ruin your day. "Orion, we're restructuring the IT department," she said, not even bothering to look up from her laptop screen. "Your position has been eliminated." Just like that. 8 years of 60-hour weeks, missed dinners, and weekend emergencies reduced to a manila envelope with severance papers and a security escort to clean out my desk. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd automated half the department's processes so efficiently that they no longer needed the person who'd created them. I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking garage for 20 minutes, staring at the concrete wall and trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my brain was already calculating unemployment benefits, reviewing our savings account balance, and mentally cataloging which expenses we could cut. The emotional part was somewhere between numb and furious. When I finally drove home to our apartment on Maple Street, I expected Cambria to be sympathetic. We'd been together for 4 years, living together for 2. She knew how much that job meant to me, how I'd built the entire network infrastructure from scratch when the company was just a startup with 12 employees. I found her in our bedroom, folding clothes with mechanical precision. Not unusual. Cambria always cleaned when she was stressed. What was unusual was that she was folding everything into her expensive leather suitcases instead of putting them away. "Hey," I said from the doorway, my voice probably sounding as hollow as I felt. "We need to talk." She didn't look up. "I heard about Morrison Industries. Jennifer from accounting texted me around 1. Then you know why I'm home early. I know why you're unemployed." She finally met my eyes, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Not sympathy, not concern, but calculation. The same look she got when she was reviewing contracts at her law firm. "Orion, I need to be honest with you about something." I leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling very tired. "What's that?" "I'm not ready to live in poverty." She zipped up the first suitcase with a sharp sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "I'd rather choose a richer man." For a moment I thought she was joking. Cambria had a dry sense of humor, and this seemed like exactly the kind of dark comedy she'd use to lighten a terrible day. But she kept packing, methodically emptying her half of our shared dresser. "You're serious," I said. "Completely serious." She paused, then corrected herself. "Completely serious. Look, Orion, you're a good guy. You're smart, you're reliable, and you make me laugh. But I have plans. I want the house in Riverside Heights, the BMW, the vacations in Europe. I want to send our future kids to private school and have a wine cellar and a housekeeper who comes twice a week." "We can have those things," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew how weak it sounded. "I'll find another job. Maybe this is an opportunity to—" "With what?" She gestured around our modest one-bedroom apartment with its second-hand furniture and my collection of technical manuals stacked on every available surface. "You're 32, Orion. If you were going to be wealthy, it would have happened by now. I can't wait around hoping you'll figure it out." The clinical way she laid out her reasoning was almost worse than if she'd screamed at me. This wasn't an emotional decision made in the heat of the moment. She'd clearly been thinking about this for a while, probably since I'd mentioned that Morrison Industries was struggling and layoffs were possible. "So what? You're just leaving? Tonight?" "I signed a lease this afternoon." She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of a downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and granite countertops. "Troy Solis is helping me move in." Troy Solis. I knew the name from Cambria's work stories. He was some hotshot entrepreneur who'd started a financial consulting firm and drove a Tesla. They'd met at a networking event 3 months ago, and she'd mentioned him several times since then, always with a tone of admiration I'd foolishly assumed was purely professional. You've been planning this, I said. I've been keeping my options open. She lifted the suitcase off the bed and set it by the door. Troy understands ambition. He understands what it takes to build the life I want. And I don't? You understand contentment, Orion. You're happy with good enough. I'm not. She moved past me to the bathroom and started gathering her toiletries. I watched her pack her expensive skincare products, the ones that cost more than our monthly grocery budget, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not heartbreak exactly. Something more like clarity. The lease on this place is in my name, I said. I know. I'll be off it by the end of the week. She didn't even pause in her packing. I already talked to the landlord. Mr. Fairbanks agreed to let you off the lease? Troy's lawyer handled it. Something about financial hardship and changed circumstances. She shrugged. Don't worry. You can probably get a roommate or move somewhere cheaper. I stepped aside as she wheeled her suitcases toward the front door. 4 years of shared life reduced to 2 bags and a casual suggestion that I find a roommate. She paused at the door and turned back to me. For what it's worth, I am sorry it worked out this way, she said. You deserve someone who wants the same things you do. And what is it you think I want? Safety, predictability, a quiet life where the biggest excitement is a new video game or a weekend camping trip. She adjusted her purse strap. There's nothing wrong with that, Orion. It's just not what I want. After she left, I sat in our suddenly too quiet apartment and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 6 hours, I'd lost my job and my girlfriend. The woman I'd been planning to propose to. The ring was hidden in my sock drawer, purchased with 3 months of overtime pay, had walked out without a backward glance. I should have been devastated. I should have been angry or heartbroken or at least surprised. Instead, I felt oddly detached, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the strange relief of finally seeing Cambria's true priorities laid out so clearly. I ordered pizza and spent the evening reviewing my finances. Without Cambria's income from the law firm, I had about 3 months of expenses saved up. Unemployment would cover maybe 60% of my previous salary. I'd need to find something quickly, and in the current job market, that wasn't guaranteed. My phone buzzed around 11 with a text from Cambria. Left some things in the storage unit. I'll get them this weekend. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and started updating my resume. If she wanted to see what ambition looked like, I'd show her. I'd find a better job, build a better life, and prove that her calculation had been wrong. I had no idea that by morning, everything would change again. The call came at 7:30 a.m. while I was drinking coffee and scrolling through job listings. The number was from Colorado, which seemed odd since I didn't know anyone there. Is this Orion Vanton? The voice was elderly, formal. Yes, this is Orion. Mr. Vanton, this is Harold Wickham from Wickham Torres and Associates. We're the law firm handling the estate of your uncle, Marcus Vanton. Uncle Marcus. I hadn't heard that name in probably 15 years. He was my father's brother, a reclusive guy who'd made some kind of fortune in mining or real estate. The family stories were always vague. He'd sent Christmas cards with $50 bills when I was a kid, but after my parents had some falling out with him, he'd disappeared from our lives entirely. I'm sorry to hear he passed, I said, though I felt more curiosity than grief for a man I barely remembered. Mr. Vanton, I'm calling to inform you that you've been named as the sole beneficiary of your uncle's estate. I nearly dropped my coffee mug. I'm sorry, what? Your uncle left specific instructions that his estate should go to you. The total value, after taxes and fees, comes to approximately $6.4 million. The apartment went very quiet. I could hear my neighbor's television through the thin walls, the sound of traffic outside, my own heartbeat in my ears. 6.4 million, I repeated. Yes, sir. There are some formalities to complete, but the inheritance is straightforward. Your uncle was quite specific about his wishes. I spent the next hour on the phone with Mr. Wickham, learning about trust funds and tax implications and wire transfers. Uncle Marcus had apparently spent his final years investing wisely and living modestly in a cabin outside Denver. He'd never married, had no children, and according to his will, had chosen me because I was the only one in the family with any sense. By 9 a.m., I was officially wealthy. Not just comfortable, not just secure, but genuinely, life-changingly wealthy. I could buy the house in Riverside Heights that Cambria wanted. I could buy 10 of them. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the confirmation email from the law firm, and started laughing. Not happy laughter, something darker and more ironic. Cambria had left me because I wasn't rich enough. Less than 12 hours later, I had more money than she'd ever dreamed of. The smart thing to do would have been to call her immediately, to tell her about the inheritance and see if she wanted to reconsider. Maybe we could work things out, build that life she'd described, have those conversations about houses and vacations and private schools for kids we didn't have yet. But I didn't call her. Instead, I made myself another cup of coffee and started thinking about numbers. Cambria had always been impressed by people who thought strategically, who planned several moves ahead. Troy Solis, for instance, with his startup and his Tesla and his downtown loft. She wanted to see ambition. She wanted to see what strategic thinking looked like. I opened my laptop and started researching property management companies. If Cambria thought she understood numbers, she was about to get an education. The first thing I did was set up a shell company. Vancorp Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware with a local attorney as the agent. Completely legal, completely anonymous, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. The second thing I did was research Troy Solis's financial consulting firm. Solis Solutions had been growing rapidly, but growth required capital, and capital meant debt. According to public filings, Troy had leveraged his business heavily to afford the downtown office space and the lifestyle that impressed clients like Cambria. The third thing I did was find out who owned the building Cambria had moved into. Riverside Tower was owned by a small real estate investment group that specialized in luxury rentals. They'd purchased the building 2 years ago with a significant mortgage and were still carrying substantial debt. By Thursday afternoon, I owned Riverside Tower through Vancorp Holdings. By Friday morning, I'd purchased Troy's business loans from 3 different lenders and consolidated them under a single note. Cambria thought she'd chosen the richer man. She'd chosen the man who looked richer. There's a difference, and she was about to learn exactly what it meant. I spent the weekend saying nothing, doing nothing visible, just watching and planning. Cambria posted photos on social media from her new loft, looking happy and confident. Troy shared pictures of his Tesla and made posts about exciting new ventures and strategic partnerships. Neither of them had any idea that their landlord and creditor was sitting 3 miles away in a modest apartment, drinking coffee and calculating their next moves for them. On Monday morning, I sent 2 letters. The first went to Troy Solis, informing him that his business loans had been consolidated and that new terms would be forthcoming. The second went to Cambria Vanton, informing her that her rent was increasing from $3,000 to $6,000 per month, effective immediately, as allowed under the month-to-month clause she'd signed. I hand-delivered both letters myself, leaving them with the building's concierge with instructions that they be delivered immediately. Then I drove to the coffee shop across the street and waited. Troy appeared first, storming out of the building with the letter in his hand and his phone pressed to his ear. Even from across the street, I could see the panic in his body language as he paced back and forth on the sidewalk. Cambria emerged 20 minutes later, moving with the quick, purposeful stride she used when she was angry. She was also on her phone, probably calling Troy or maybe her lawyer friends to ask about tenant rights. I finished my coffee and drove home, feeling something I hadn't experienced since I was a kid playing chess with my grandfather. The satisfaction of a plan coming together, of seeing several moves ahead while your opponent was still trying to figure out what game you were playing. My phone rang that evening, Cambria's number. "Hello, Cambria," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Orion, we need to talk." "About what?" "About this harassment campaign you're running." Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "The rent increase, the letters to Troy. This is pathetic, even for you." "I'm not sure what you mean," I said. "I don't have anything to do with your housing situation." "Don't play stupid with me. I know you're behind this somehow." "How would I be behind it? I'm unemployed, remember? I don't have the resources to influence your rent." There was a long pause. I could practically hear her trying to work out the logic, trying to figure out how someone she'd left because he was poor could suddenly have enough influence to affect her living situation. "This is about revenge," she said finally. "This is about numbers," I replied. "You said you'd rather choose a richer man. Sounds like you chose correctly." I hung up before she could respond. The next few days were instructive. I'd always known Cambria was smart, but I'd underestimated just how ruthless she could be when she felt threatened. She didn't waste time on emotional appeals or attempts at reconciliation. Instead, she went straight for the throat. The first attack came through my former employer. I got a call from Janet Morrison on Wednesday morning asking if I could come in to discuss some irregularities that had been brought to their attention regarding my final projects. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint suggesting that I might have taken proprietary information when I left. "This is just a formality, Orion," Janet said, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "We need to document that all company property was returned and that there weren't any unauthorized data transfers." I agreed to come in that afternoon, mainly because I was curious about how Cambria had managed to plant that particular seed. She'd never shown much interest in my work, but she'd apparently paid enough attention to know which buttons to push. The meeting was exactly as pointless as I'd expected. I'd been meticulous about returning company property, and my final projects were all documented with proper handover notes. After an hour of going through files and reviewing access logs, Janet looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry about this, Orion. Someone called our legal department claiming they had information about potential intellectual property theft. We had to follow up." "Someone anonymous?" "A woman. Said she was concerned about the company's security." Janet shook her head. "Probably just someone with a grudge. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. Cambria had calculated that even a baseless accusation would cost me time and stress, and might potentially damage my reputation if I needed references for future jobs. It was a smart move, professionally speaking. Personally, it told me everything I needed to know about how this game was going to be played. The second attack was more personal. I came home from the Morrison meeting to find my parents' car in the parking lot of my apartment complex. Mom and Dad lived about an hour away and rarely visited unannounced, so their presence was immediately suspicious. I found them in the lobby, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. Dad was wearing his serious conversation expression, the same one he'd worn when he'd explained why they couldn't afford to send me to my first-choice college. "Orion," Mom said, "we need to talk." "About what?" "About Cambria," Dad said. "She came to see us yesterday." Of course she had. Cambria had always been charming with my parents, and they'd been thrilled when I'd started dating a lawyer. In their minds, she represented stability and success, the kind of woman who could help their underachieving son finally live up to his potential. "What did she tell you?" I asked, though I could already guess. "She's worried about you," Mom said. "She said you've been acting erratically since you lost your job, following her, making threats, trying to interfere with her new relationship. She said you might be having some kind of breakdown," Dad added, "that you're obsessed with getting back at her for moving on." I looked at my parents, these people who'd raised me and supposedly knew me better than anyone, and realized that Cambria had played them perfectly. She'd presented herself as the concerned ex-girlfriend, worried about my mental health, and asking for their help in getting me the support I needed. And you believed her? She seemed genuinely concerned, Mom said. She said she still cares about you, but that you're scaring her. Did she mention why she left? Dad shifted uncomfortably. She said you two had different goals, that you wanted different things out of life. That's one way to put it. I sat down across from them in the lobby's small seating area. Did she tell you she left me for someone with more money? That she literally said she'd rather choose a richer man? Orion, Mom said gently, that doesn't sound like Cambria. It sounds exactly like Cambria. You just never saw that side of her. We talked for another hour, but it was clear that Cambria had gotten there first with her version of events. My parents weren't entirely convinced by her story, but they were worried enough to drive an hour to check on me. They left with promises that I'd call if I needed anything, and gentle suggestions that maybe I should talk to someone about processing the breakup. The third attack came through social media. I didn't use Facebook or Instagram much, but I had accounts that were connected to enough mutual friends that word would spread quickly. Cambria had posted a carefully crafted message about moving on from toxic relationships and hoping that certain people would respect boundaries and stop trying to interfere with her happiness. She didn't mention me by name, but the context was clear enough that anyone who knew us would understand who she was talking about. The post had dozens of sympathetic comments from her law school friends and professional contacts, all expressing support and offering advice about restraining orders and personal safety. It was a masterful piece of character assassination. She'd positioned herself as the victim of a bitter ex-boyfriend's harassment campaign, while simultaneously making it impossible for me to defend myself without looking exactly like the obsessed stalker she was describing. I had to admire the strategy, even as I recognized it for what it was, a preemptive strike designed to isolate me socially and professionally before I could mount any kind of counterattack. Cambria had always been good at managing her image, but this was next-level reputation management. Unfortunately for her, she'd made one critical miscalculation. She was playing a game where reputation and social standing mattered, where public perception could be weaponized and professional networks could be leveraged for personal gain. It was a game she was very good at, a game she'd been playing successfully for years. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. While Cambria was busy managing her image and Troy was scrambling to understand his new financial situation, I was playing a different game entirely. A game where the only score that mattered was the one kept in bank accounts and property deeds and legal documents that couldn't be spun or reframed or explained away. Thursday morning, I called the property management company that handled Riverside Tower and informed them that Vancorp Holdings would be implementing new policies for month-to-month tenants. Effective immediately, all month-to-month leases would require a personal guarantor with verified assets of at least 5 times the annual rent. For Cambria's loft, that meant finding someone willing to guarantee $360,000 in potential liability. Given that she'd just told her social network that she was being harassed by an unstable ex-boyfriend, finding someone willing to take on that kind of financial risk was going to be challenging. Friday afternoon, I sent Troy a formal notice that his consolidated business loan was being called due in 30 days, completely legal under the terms he'd originally agreed to, and completely devastating to a business that was operating on leveraged growth and projected future earnings. Friday evening, I drove to the coffee shop across from Riverside Tower and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Troy came out first, moving with the jerky, agitated movements of someone who was barely keeping panic at bay. He was on his phone again, probably talking to lawyers or accountants or anyone who might be able to explain how his carefully constructed financial house of cards was suddenly collapsing. Cambria appeared a few minutes later, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she looked genuinely shaken. Her usual confident stride was gone, replaced by the uncertain gait of someone who was beginning to realize that the ground beneath her feet wasn't as solid as she'd thought. They met on the sidewalk and had what looked like an intense conversation. Even from across the street, I could see the stress in their body language, the way they kept gesturing at the building behind them and checking their phones. After about 10 minutes, Troy got in his Tesla and drove away. Cambria stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking up at the building that housed her expensive loft, then pulled out her phone. My phone rang. "Hello, Cambria." "We need to meet," she said without preamble. "Tonight." "I don't think that's a good idea. According to your social media posts, I'm supposed to be respecting your boundaries." "Cut the act, Orion. I know this is you." "I still don't know what you're talking about." "The rent increase, Troy's loan being called, the guarantor requirement." Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. "I don't know how you're doing it, but I know it's you." "That's quite an accusation. Do you have any proof?" There was a long pause. "What do you want?" "I want exactly what you said you wanted. I want numbers to matter. I want the richer man to win." "This is insane, Orion. You're destroying yourself just to hurt me." "Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're the one with problems. Your rent doubled, your boyfriend's business is failing, and you can't find anyone willing to guarantee your lease. Meanwhile, I'm just sitting in my apartment, collecting unemployment and updating my resume. This has to stop." "What has to stop? I haven't done anything to you, Cambria. I haven't contacted you. I haven't threatened you. I haven't interfered with your relationship. All I've done is exactly what you suggested. I've accepted that you'd rather choose a richer man." I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, probably trying to figure out her next move. Cambria was used to being the smartest person in the room, used to being able to outmaneuver people through superior planning and strategic thinking. But strategy only worked when you understood what game was being played. "If this continues," she said finally, "I'll have to take legal action." "For what? You'd have to prove I'm involved in something, and I'm just an unemployed guy with no resources and no connections, remember? I'll figure it out." "I'm sure you will. You're very smart, Cambria. I'm sure you'll find a way to solve all these problems that definitely aren't connected to me in any way." I hung up and sat in my car for a few more minutes, watching the building where my ex-girlfriend was probably pacing around her expensive loft, trying to figure out how someone she'd dismissed as unambitious and financially irrelevant had suddenly become the source of all her problems. The satisfaction was even better than I'd expected. Not because I was hurting her, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but because I was finally playing the game at her level. For 4 years, I'd been the supportive boyfriend, the reliable partner, the guy who handled the practical stuff while she focused on her career and her ambitions and her plans for a better life. Now, she was getting a demonstration of what I could do when I stopped being supportive and started being strategic. But this was just the opening move. Cambria was smart and resourceful, and she wouldn't give up easily. If anything, I'd just motivated her to escalate her own campaign. She'd come back harder, smarter, more ruthless. I was counting on it. Saturday morning, I drove to the boxing gym where I'd been working out since college. Murphy's gym was the kind of place that attracted serious athletes and people who needed to hit things for therapeutic reasons. The equipment was old but well-maintained. The clientele was diverse but universally focused. And the owner, Les Murphy, was a former professional boxer who'd seen enough of life to offer perspective without judgment. Les was in his office when I arrived, reviewing paperwork and drinking coffee that looked strong enough to strip paint. He looked up when I knocked on the door frame. "Orion, haven't seen you in a while. I've been dealing with some personal stuff. The kind of personal stuff that requires hitting things? Something like that." Les gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Want to talk about it?" I'd known Les for almost 10 years, and in that time he'd become something like a mentor. Not in any formal sense, but in the way that older men sometimes took an interest in younger ones who reminded them of themselves. Les had grown up poor, made some money as a professional fighter, lost it all in bad investments, and then rebuilt his life around the gym. He understood ambition and disappointment and the sometimes complicated relationship between the two. My girlfriend left me when I lost my job, I said. Said she'd rather choose a richer man. That's rough. Les leaned back in his chair. But probably not the whole story. 2 weeks later, I inherited $6 million from an uncle I barely knew. Les raised an eyebrow. Plot twist. She doesn't know about the money. I haven't told anyone. And now you're thinking about revenge. It wasn't a question. Les had been around long enough to recognize the look of someone who was planning something they probably shouldn't do. I'm thinking about justice, I said. Same thing, usually, when it comes to matters of the heart. Les took a sip of his coffee. What kind of justice are we talking about? I told him about the property purchases, the loan consolidation, the rent increases and guarantor requirements. Les listened without comment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions about the legal and financial details. Smart, he said when I finished. Cold, but smart. You're hitting her where it hurts without giving her anything she can use against you. But nothing. You asked for my opinion, and my opinion is that you're playing a dangerous game with someone who's probably better at it than you are. What do you mean? You're thinking like an engineer, Orion. You see a problem, you design a solution, you implement it step by step. That's good for building computer networks. It's not necessarily good for dealing with people who are willing to fight dirty. Les stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the main gym floor. A few early morning regulars were working through their routines, the sound of gloves hitting bags providing a steady rhythm. You want some advice? He asked. That's why I'm here. If you're going to do this, commit to it completely. Don't half-measure, don't pull punches, and don't assume she's going to play fair just because you are. He turned back to me. And be prepared for the possibility that winning this game might cost you more than losing it would have. What do you mean? I mean that revenge changes you, kid. You start out thinking you're evening the score, and you end up becoming someone you don't recognize, someone who calculates other people's pain and calls it justice. I thought about that as I worked out for the next hour, pushing myself harder than I had in months. Les was right that this was dangerous. He was right that Cambria was probably better at playing dirty than I was. But he was wrong about one thing. I wasn't trying to even the score. I was trying to win decisively enough that there wouldn't be any question about who had chosen correctly. Cambria had made her decision based on a calculation about wealth and security and the kind of life she wanted to live. I was going to prove that her calculation had been wrong. When I got home, there was an envelope taped to my door. No return address, just my name written in Cambria's precise handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. I know what you're doing, and I know why you're doing it. This ends now, or I make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are. Last warning. I read the note twice, then folded it carefully and put it in my desk drawer with all the other documentation I'd been collecting. Threats in writing were evidence, and evidence was useful when games escalated beyond financial maneuvering. Cambria thought she was giving me a last warning. What she'd actually done was give me permission to stop playing defensively. The gloves were off now, and I was ready to show her what strategic thinking really looked like. Cambria's warning note was delivered on Saturday. By Monday morning, she'd made good on her threat in a way that was both more subtle and more vicious than I'd expected. The call came from David Chen, a recruiter I'd been working with to find a new position. David had been optimistic about my prospects. Experienced IT managers with my background were in demand, and he'd already lined up several promising interviews. Orion, we need to talk, David said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality that professionals used when delivering bad news. Can you come in this afternoon? Is there a problem with one of the interviews? It's better if we discuss this in person. David's office was in a sleek downtown building that catered to consulting firms and professional services companies. I'd been there twice before, and both times the atmosphere had been optimistic and forward-looking. Today felt different. David closed his office door and gestured for me to sit down. He was a good recruiter, smart, well-connected, and honest about market realities. The fact that he looked uncomfortable was not a good sign. "I got a call this morning," he said without preamble. "Someone claiming to have information about your professional conduct that potential employers should know about." "What kind of information?" "The caller said you'd been terminated from Morrison Industries for cause, that there were questions about intellectual property theft, and that you'd been harassing former colleagues since leaving the company." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that my understanding was that you'd been laid off as part of a restructuring, and that I'd need to see documentation of any misconduct allegations before I could take them seriously." David leaned forward. "Orion, is there anything you need to tell me about how things ended at Morrison?" "I was laid off. Clean termination, good references, no misconduct allegations. I can get you documentation from HR if you need it." "I believe you, but here's the problem. 3 of the companies I'd lined up interviews with got similar calls, anonymous tips about your character and professional conduct, all from the same person, according to the descriptions. A woman who claimed to be a concerned colleague who'd worked with you previously." David shook his head. "I've seen this before, Orion. Usually it's an ex-spouse or former partner trying to sabotage someone's career. Is there anyone in your personal life who might want to hurt your job prospects?" I thought about lying, but David had been straight with me, and I owed him the same courtesy. "My ex-girlfriend. We had a bad breakup, and she's been trying to make my life difficult." "Can you prove that?" "Probably. But it would require explaining the whole situation, and that gets complicated quickly." David nodded. "Here's what I can do. I'll reach out to my contacts and explain that you're dealing with a malicious ex who's making false claims. Most hiring managers have seen this before, and they'll be willing to verify information directly with your former employer rather than relying on anonymous tips. And if they're not willing, then we focus on companies that do proper background checks instead of listening to random phone calls." David's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "It's going to slow things down, Orion. Some doors that were open are going to close, at least temporarily." I left David's office feeling like I'd been sucker punched. Cambria hadn't just attacked my current situation. She'd gone after my future prospects. It was a smart move, professionally devastating and almost impossible to counter directly. How do you prove that anonymous phone calls are coming from a vindictive ex without sounding exactly like the kind of unstable person who would attract vindictive exes? But if Cambria thought she could pressure me into backing down by threatening my career, she'd miscalculated badly. I didn't need a job anymore. I had 6.4 million reasons to be patient with my employment situation. What I needed was leverage. I spent Monday evening researching Troy Solis's business in detail. Solis Solutions was built on a simple model. Troy provided financial consulting to small businesses and startups, helping them optimize their cash flow and investment strategies. His client list was impressive, about 30 companies, ranging from tech startups to established family businesses. The problem with Troy's model was that it required constant capital infusion to maintain the lifestyle that attracted high-end clients. The downtown office, the Tesla, the expensive suits, the networking events, all of it was designed to project success and stability. But according to the financial documents I'd acquired when I purchased his loans, Troy was leveraged to the breaking point. His consulting fees barely covered his overhead, and he'd been using business credit lines to fund his personal expenses. The only thing keeping him afloat was the assumption that his client base would continue growing and that future earnings would cover current debts. When I called his loans due, I'd essentially forced him to choose between bankruptcy and finding a new source of capital immediately. Based on his credit profile, traditional lenders weren't going to be an option. Tuesday morning, I had Vancorp Holdings send Troy a proposal. We would restructure his debt with more favorable terms in exchange for a controlling interest in Solace Solutions. He could keep running the company, keep his title, keep his clients. But he'd be working for me. The alternative was bankruptcy, which would mean losing everything and probably facing personal liability for the business credit lines he'd guaranteed. I didn't expect him to accept immediately. Troy struck me as the kind of person who would exhaust every other option before admitting defeat. But I wanted the offer on the table so he'd know exactly what his choices were. Wednesday morning brought another surprise. I was drinking coffee and reading the business section when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my parents' number. "Orion," Mom said, "your father and I need to apologize." "For what?" "Cambria called us again yesterday. She said some things that made us realize we hadn't been getting the whole story." I set down my coffee cup. "What kind of things?" "She wanted us to help her get you committed for psychiatric evaluation," Dad said, his voice tight with anger. "Said you were becoming dangerous and that she was afraid for her safety." And when we asked for specifics, her story started falling apart," Mom continued. "She couldn't explain how someone who was supposedly broke and unemployed was managing to interfere with her housing situation. She couldn't provide any evidence of threats or harassment. She just kept insisting that you were obsessed with her and that we needed to take action." "What did you tell her?" "We told her that if she was genuinely afraid, she should contact the police instead of asking us to have our son involuntarily committed," Dad said. "Then we told her not to contact us again unless she had actual evidence of wrongdoing." I felt something loosen in my chest. My parents believing Cambria's version of events had been one of the most painful parts of this whole situation. Having them see through her manipulation was worth more than any financial victory. "Thank you," I said. "We should have trusted you from the beginning," Mom said. "We know you, Orion. You're not the kind of person who would harass someone or make threats. We let ourselves get confused by someone who's very good at sounding reasonable." After I hung up, I realized that Cambria had made another miscalculation. She'd pushed too hard, asked for too much, and revealed her true motivations to people who'd previously been sympathetic to her story. The psychiatric commitment gambit was particularly telling. It showed that she was getting desperate and starting to make mistakes. Desperate people made poor strategic decisions. They took unnecessary risks and overlooked important details. They focused on short-term tactics instead of long-term consequences. I was counting on Cambria's desperation to work in my favor. Thursday afternoon, Troy called me directly. I'd been expecting some kind of contact, but I'd assumed it would come through lawyers or intermediaries. The fact that he was reaching out personally suggested that his situation was even worse than I'd calculated. "We need to meet," he said without introduction. "Tonight." "Who is this?" "You know who this is, and you know why I'm calling." "I'm afraid I don't. You might have the wrong number." There was a pause. "Look, I know you're behind Vancorp Holdings. I don't know how you managed it, but I know it's you. We need to talk about the restructuring proposal. I think there's been some confusion. I'm not involved with any holdings company." "Stop playing games, Orion. Cambria told me about the inheritance." The line went quiet. Troy had just confirmed what I'd suspected. Cambria had figured out where my sudden resources were coming from. She was smarter than I'd given her credit for, which meant she was also more dangerous. "What inheritance?" I asked. "The $6 million from your uncle. The money you've been using to buy up our debts and manipulate our living situation." "That's an interesting theory. Do you have any proof?" Another pause. "What do you want?" "I want you to explain why you think I have anything to do with your business problems." "Because the timing is too convenient. Because Vancorp Holdings didn't exist 6 months ago. Because someone with access to serious capital decided to target both me and Cambria at exactly the same time. Troy was smarter than he looked, but he was also panicked. Panic made people say things they shouldn't say, admit things they should keep to themselves. Even if your theory was correct, I said, what would you propose to do about it? We make a deal. You restructure my debt on reasonable terms. You stop interfering with Cambria's housing, and we all move on with our lives. And in exchange? In exchange, we don't go public with what we know about your financial manipulation. I almost laughed. Troy was trying to blackmail me with information that wasn't actually damaging. There was nothing illegal about buying property or purchasing debt. There was nothing unethical about charging market rates for rent or calling loans due according to their original terms. That doesn't sound like much of an offer, I said. Then what do you want? I want you to accept the restructuring proposal exactly as written. Controlling interest in Solace Solutions in exchange for debt forgiveness and new capital. That's insane. You'd be stealing my company. I'd be saving your company, and your house, and your car, and your reputation. I let that sink in for a moment. The alternative is bankruptcy, Troy. Public, messy, career-ending bankruptcy. I need time to think about it. You have until Friday at 5 p.m. After that, the offer expires and the loans remain due in full. I hung up before he could respond. Troy was going to spend the next day scrambling for alternatives, calling in favors, exploring every possible option for avoiding my deal. But his credit was maxed out, his business was over-leveraged, and his personal guarantees meant that bankruptcy would cost him everything. By Friday afternoon, he'd realized that working for me was better than not working at all. Friday morning brought the call I'd been expecting from Cambria. We need to meet, she said. Face to face, tonight. I don't think that's a good idea, given your concerns about harassment and stalking. Cut the act, Orion. I know about the inheritance. I know you're behind Vancorp Holdings. I know you've been manipulating our financial situation to get back at me for leaving. Those are serious accusations. I hope you have evidence to support them. I have Troy's testimony about your phone call yesterday. I have documentation of the timing of our rent increase and his loan being called. I have records showing that Vancorp Holdings was incorporated 2 days after you would have received the inheritance funds. She'd been busy and thorough. Cambria had always been good at building cases, and she'd apparently decided to treat this situation like a legal matter that required evidence and documentation. Interesting theory, I said. What do you plan to do with this information? That depends on what you want. I want exactly what I've always wanted. I want you to be happy with your choice. This has gone far enough, Orion. You've made your point. You've shown that you have resources and that you can make our lives difficult. Now let's be adults and figure out how to resolve this. What did you have in mind? We meet tonight. We discuss terms. We find a way for everyone to move forward without destroying each other. I considered the offer. Cambria was essentially proposing a negotiated settlement, which suggested that she was feeling enough pressure to consider compromise, but it also suggested that she thought she had enough leverage to negotiate from a position of strength. Where? I asked. Murphy's Bar on 5th Street, 8 p.m. Murphy's Bar was a public place, well lit, with plenty of witnesses. Cambria was being smart about personal safety while still agreeing to meet. She was also choosing neutral ground where neither of us would have an advantage. I'll be there, I said. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment and tried to figure out what Cambria's endgame was. She'd agreed to meet, which meant she wanted something she thought I might be willing to give her. But she'd also been building a case against me, which suggested she was preparing for the possibility that negotiation would fail. The most likely scenario was that she was going to offer me some kind of deal, maybe a public reconciliation, maybe a financial settlement, maybe just an agreement to leave each other alone. In exchange, she'd want me to stop the financial pressure and let her and Troy rebuild their lives. The problem with that scenario was that it assumed I wanted something she could give me. Money wasn't an issue anymore. Public vindication wasn't necessary. Social rehabilitation wasn't important. What I wanted was for Cambria to understand that her calculation had been wrong, that choosing the richer man had actually been choosing the poorer one, that her strategic thinking had been based on incomplete information and faulty assumptions. I wanted her to realize that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life, and that the consequences of that mistake were going to follow her for a very long time. 8 p.m. at Murphy's Bar was going to be very interesting. Murphy's Bar was exactly the kind of place Cambria would have avoided 6 months ago. Dim lighting, worn wooden floors, and a clientele that leaned more toward blue-collar workers than legal professionals. The fact that she'd chosen it for our meeting was probably strategic, somewhere she thought I'd be comfortable and off guard. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a booth near the back where we could talk without being overheard. The Friday evening crowd was light, mostly regulars watching the baseball game on the mounted television and a few couples on casual dates. Cambria walked in at exactly 8 p.m., moving with the confident stride I remembered but wearing an expression I'd rarely seen before. She looked tired, stressed, and slightly uncertain, a combination that humanized her in a way that was both unexpected and unwelcome. She'd dressed down for the occasion, trading her usual professional attire for jeans and a simple blouse. No jewelry except for small earrings, minimal makeup, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The overall effect was to make her look younger and more vulnerable, which was probably intentional. "Hello, Orion," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "Cambria, you look good." "I look exhausted, but thank you." She signaled the bartender and ordered a glass of wine, then turned her attention back to me. "How have you been?" "Unemployed, collecting benefits, living in the same apartment you thought was too small and too cheap." I gestured around the bar. "Spending my evenings in places like this." "Right. The same apartment that somehow generates enough income for you to buy commercial real estate and purchase business loans." I smiled. That does sound unlikely, doesn't it? The bartender brought Cambria's wine, and she took a careful sip before continuing. "I've spent the last week trying to figure out how you managed to acquire the resources to orchestrate this campaign against Troy and me. The timeline doesn't work unless you had access to significant capital immediately after I left." "What's your theory?" "My theory is that you inherited money from your uncle Marcus, probably a substantial amount, given the scope of what you've been able to accomplish." She leaned forward slightly. "My question is why you didn't tell me about it." "When should I have told you? Before you packed your bags? Or after you explained that you'd rather choose a richer man? You could have called me the next day. You could have explained that our financial situation had changed dramatically. And then what? You would have unpacked your bags and pretended that your little speech about poverty and ambition never happened." Cambria was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass between her hands. "I would have reconsidered my decision, yes. Based on new financial information. Based on changed circumstances. So your feelings for me were negotiable depending on my net worth." "My feelings for you were never the issue, Orion. My feelings about our future together were what concerned me." I had to give her credit for consistency. Even now, facing the consequences of her calculation, she was sticking to the logic that had driven her decision. Love was secondary to financial security, and financial security was a prerequisite for the life she wanted to build. "Well, you got your wish," I said. "You chose the richer man. How's that working out for you?" "You know exactly how it's working out, since you're the one orchestrating our problems." Her voice carried a note of frustration. "Troy's business is failing because you called his loans due. Our housing situation is unstable because you doubled our rent and imposed impossible guarantor requirements. My reputation is being damaged because people are starting to ask questions about why my life is falling apart so dramatically. Those all sound like consequences of poor financial planning. Maybe you should have chosen someone with better credit. This isn't about Troy's credit, and you know it. This is about you using your inheritance to punish me for making a decision you didn't like. She was right, of course. But being right about my motivations didn't change the fundamental reality of her situation. She'd made a choice based on incomplete information, and now she was dealing with the consequences of that choice. What do you want, Cambria? I want this to stop. I want you to restructure Troy's debt on reasonable terms, remove the guarantor requirement from our lease, and let us rebuild our lives without interference. And in exchange? In exchange, I'll publicly acknowledge that I made a mistake in how I handled our breakup. I'll correct the narrative about your behavior and make sure your reputation isn't damaged by the stories I've been telling. It was a reasonable offer, strategically speaking. Cambria was proposing a face-saving compromise that would allow both of us to move forward without further escalation. She'd get financial relief, and I'd get public vindication. The problem was that public vindication wasn't what I wanted anymore. That's generous, I said, but I don't think it addresses the real issue. Which is? The real issue is that you made a fundamental miscalculation about who was the richer man. You chose Troy because he looked successful, because he had the visible markers of wealth and ambition. You didn't bother to look deeper, to understand the difference between income and assets, between lifestyle and actual financial security. I couldn't have known about your inheritance. You could have known about Troy's debt. You could have done basic due diligence before betting your future on someone else's business plan. I leaned back in the booth. You're a lawyer, Cambria. You're supposed to be good at evaluating risk and analyzing financial documents, but you got dazzled by the Tesla and the downtown loft and forgot to ask the important questions. So this is about proving that I'm not as smart as I think I am? This is about proving that your priorities were wrong. You said you'd rather choose a richer man, but you chose based on appearances instead of reality. You chose the guy with the higher credit card bills instead of the guy with the actual assets. Cambria set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You've changed, Orion. The man I was with for 4 years wouldn't have orchestrated this kind of campaign. He wouldn't have taken pleasure in watching other people's lives fall apart. The man you were with for 4 years wouldn't have needed to. He would have trusted that the woman he loved valued their relationship more than his bank account balance. And when that trust turned out to be misplaced, then he learned to play by different rules. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of 4 years of shared history settling between us. I'd expected this conversation to feel triumphant, to provide the satisfaction of watching Cambria finally understand the magnitude of her mistake. Instead, it felt hollow and sad, like the ending of something that had been important once, but couldn't be repaired. What happens now? She asked finally. Now you deal with the consequences of your choice. Troy's business fails or gets restructured on my terms. You find new housing that fits your actual budget instead of the lifestyle you wanted to project. You rebuild your life based on realistic financial planning instead of wishful thinking about other people's resources. And you? What do you get out of this? I get the satisfaction of knowing that numbers don't lie, that all your strategic thinking and careful planning couldn't overcome the basic fact that you didn't have accurate information to work with. Cambria finished her wine and stood up. For what it's worth, Orion, I am sorry about how I handled the breakup. You deserved better than that speech about poverty and ambition. You deserved honesty about what I was really looking for. What were you really looking for? Security. The kind of security that comes from knowing you'll never have to worry about money, never have to choose between the life you want and the life you can afford. She picked up her purse. I thought Troy could provide that. I was wrong. And now? Now I'll figure out how to provide it for myself. She walked toward the exit, then paused and turned back. The offer stands, Orion. If you change your mind about wanting this to end, call me. I'd rather negotiate a settlement than continue fighting a war neither of us can really win. After she left, I sat in the booth for another hour, nursing a beer and thinking about what she'd said. Cambria was probably right that continuing this campaign would eventually become a war of attrition that would damage both of us. She was certainly right that I'd changed, that the person orchestrating financial revenge wasn't the same person who'd been content with quiet dinners and weekend camping trips. But she was wrong about one thing. This wasn't a war that neither of us could win. It was a war that I'd already won, the moment I'd decided to stop playing by the rules she understood and start playing by rules she couldn't anticipate. The question now was whether winning would be worth the cost of becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. I left Murphy's bar and drove home through the quiet Friday evening streets, past the downtown loft where Cambria was probably explaining our conversation to Troy, past the office buildings where other people were building the kind of conventional success that had once seemed important to me. My phone rang as I was unlocking my apartment door. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Orion Vanton? Yes. This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Metro Police Department. I need to ask you some questions about a harassment complaint that's been filed against you. I closed my apartment door and sat down heavily on my couch. Cambria had apparently decided that negotiation wasn't going to work and had moved to her next option. What kind of harassment complaint? The complainant alleges that you've been stalking her, interfering with her housing situation, and making threats against her and her boyfriend. She's provided documentation of what she claims is a pattern of escalating behavior. I see. And what exactly am I supposed to have done? I'd rather discuss that in person, Mr. Vanton. Can you come to the station tomorrow morning? Am I being charged with anything? Not at this time. We're just trying to gather information and determine whether there's sufficient evidence to pursue the matter further. After I hung up, I realized that Cambria had played her final card. She'd built a case, documented a timeline, and presented law enforcement with a narrative that painted me as an obsessed ex-boyfriend who was using financial manipulation to harass his former partner. It was a smart move, legally speaking. Even if she couldn't prove that I was behind Vancorp Holdings, she could establish a pattern of suspicious timing and suggest that I had both motive and opportunity for the kind of harassment she was alleging. The problem with her strategy was the same problem that had doomed her relationship with Troy. She was working with incomplete information and making assumptions about my resources and capabilities. Cambria thought she was escalating to a level where I couldn't follow. She was about to discover that she'd actually escalated to a level where I had significant advantages. I spent Saturday morning at the police station, answering Detective Martinez's questions with the patience of someone who had nothing to hide and the confidence of someone who had excellent legal representation on retainer. The interview was exactly what I'd expected. Cambria had presented a compelling timeline of suspicious events, but she hadn't been able to provide any direct evidence connecting me to Vancorp Holdings or the financial pressure she and Troy were experiencing. Mr. Vanton, Detective Martinez said, do you have any connection to a company called Vancorp Holdings? Not that I'm aware of. The complainant alleges that this company has been used to purchase her building and her boyfriend's business debt, and that the timing of these purchases coincides with your breakup. That does sound suspicious. Have you been able to establish any connection between me and this company? We're still investigating, but I have to ask, do you have the financial resources to be involved in this kind of real estate and debt acquisition? Detective, I'm unemployed and collecting benefits. I live in a one-bedroom apartment and drive a 10-year-old Honda. Does that sound like someone with the resources to buy commercial real estate? It was a fair question, and Detective Martinez seemed to recognize the disconnect between Cambria's allegations and my apparent circumstances. Without evidence of the inheritance or documentation connecting me to Vancorp Holdings, the harassment complaint looked like exactly what I'd suggested it was: the vindictive allegations of someone who was looking for someone to blame for her poor financial decisions. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me about your relationship with Ms. Vanton or her current boyfriend? Detective Martinez asked. Just that I hope they're able to work out their financial difficulties. Breakups are hard enough without having to deal with business problems and housing issues at the same time. I left the police station feeling confident that Cambria's legal strategy was going to backfire. She'd overplayed her hand, made allegations she couldn't support, and wasted law enforcement resources on what looked increasingly like a personal dispute rather than criminal harassment. But more importantly, she'd given me exactly the justification I needed for the final phase of my plan. If Cambria wanted to involve law enforcement, if she wanted to make this a matter of public record, if she wanted to escalate beyond financial pressure to actual legal consequences, then she was about to learn what real escalation looked like. I'd been playing defense long enough. It was time to go on offense. The police interview on Saturday morning clarified something important. Cambria was out of conventional options. She'd tried negotiation, she'd tried public pressure, and she'd tried legal intimidation. None of it had worked because she was still operating under the assumption that I was the same person she'd left 3 weeks ago. That person would have been intimidated by police interviews and harassment allegations. That person would have been worried about his reputation and his future job prospects. That person would have eventually backed down and accepted whatever face-saving compromise she was willing to offer. But that person had been replaced by someone with $6.4 million and a very clear understanding of how power actually worked. Sunday afternoon, I drove to the office building that housed Solace Solutions. Troy's consulting firm occupied a prestigious address in the financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture designed to impress potential clients, the kind of overhead that looked successful but required constant revenue to maintain. The building's parking garage was nearly empty on a Sunday, which made it easy to spot Troy's Tesla in its reserved space. I parked nearby and waited. Troy appeared around 4 p.m., moving with the harried pace of someone trying to solve an unsolvable problem. He looked like he hadn't slept well, and his usually perfect appearance was showing signs of strain. The Tesla that had once been a symbol of his success now looked like an expensive liability. I got out of my car as he approached his vehicle. "Hello, Troy." He spun around, startled. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting to talk to you about the restructuring proposal. I told you I needed time to consider it. That was yesterday. Today, the offer expires at 5 p.m. I glanced at my watch. You have about 45 minutes to make a decision. Troy looked around the empty parking garage, probably calculating whether he was safe or whether this constituted the kind of threatening behavior Cambria had reported to the police. "This is harassment," he said. "Cambria filed a complaint. The police are investigating you." "I know. I spent yesterday morning answering their questions." I leaned against my car. Interesting experience. Apparently, they need actual evidence to pursue harassment charges. Suspicious timing and personal theories aren't enough. "We know you're behind Vancorp Holdings." "Do you?" Because the detective seemed to think you were having trouble proving that connection. Troy's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it nervously. Probably a text from Cambria, asking about his location or warning him to be careful. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to accept the restructuring proposal, controlling interest in Solace Solutions in exchange for debt forgiveness and operating capital. That's not restructuring, that's acquisition. Call it whatever you want. The alternative is bankruptcy. I could find other investors. I could refinance through different lenders." "With what collateral? Your business assets are already pledged against the loans I purchased. Your personal assets are mortgaged to the limit. Your credit rating is about to crater when these loans go into default." I checked my watch again. 40 minutes, Troy. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his Tesla like it represented all the choices that had led him to this moment. The car that had impressed Cambria, the visible symbol of success that had convinced her to bet her future on his business plan. "If I agree to this," he said finally, "what happens to my role in the company?" "You continue as president and chief operating officer. You keep your office, your title, and your client relationships. You just report to a new board of directors. And my compensation? Salary plus performance bonuses based on actual profitability. No more leveraging future earnings to fund current lifestyle. It was a reasonable deal, objectively speaking. Troy would lose ownership of his company, but he'd keep his job and his income. He'd have to give up the financial risk-taking that had gotten him into this situation, but he'd also be free of the debt that was crushing his business. What about Cambria? He asked. What about her? If I agree to this, what happens to her housing situation? That's between her and her landlord. I'm not involved in her housing situation. Right. Vancorp Holdings isn't connected to you in any way. That's correct. Troy pulled out his phone and made a call. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see his body language shifting from desperate to resigned, probably talking to his lawyer or accountant, getting confirmation that he was out of alternatives. I need the terms in writing, he said when he hung up. I have them in my car. I retrieved the contract from my briefcase and handed it to Troy. He read through it carefully, probably looking for hidden clauses or unreasonable terms. But the document was straightforward: debt forgiveness and capital injection in exchange for controlling interest and board representation. This gives you the right to fire me, he said. It gives the board the right to replace management for cause, standard corporate governance. And you control the board. I control the majority interest. Troy signed the contract with the mechanical movements of someone who'd run out of choices. I countersigned and handed him a copy, then shook his hand with the professional courtesy appropriate for a business transaction. Welcome to the team, I said. Go to hell, he replied, but without much conviction. I drove home feeling like I'd just completed the most expensive chess game of my life. Troy's company was now essentially mine, which meant his ability to support the lifestyle that had attracted Cambria was now entirely dependent on my continued goodwill. Monday morning brought a call from Detective Martinez. Mr. Vanton, I wanted to follow up on our conversation Saturday. We've completed our preliminary investigation of the harassment complaint. And we're not finding sufficient evidence to pursue charges at this time. The complainant has been unable to provide documentation connecting you to the financial issues she's experiencing. I appreciate you being thorough about it. However, I do want to advise you to avoid any contact with Ms. Vanton or Mr. Salas going forward. Even if the current allegations can't be substantiated, any future contact could be seen as escalatory. I understand. I have no intention of contacting either of them. It was true, technically. I didn't need to contact them anymore. The financial pressure would continue automatically through the normal operation of business and property management. Troy would have to report to me quarterly about his company's performance. Cambria would have to find housing she could actually afford. The game was essentially over. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to accomplish. Cambria had chosen the richer man, and it had turned out to be me. Her calculation had been wrong, and the consequences of that miscalculation were now permanent parts of her life. I should have felt satisfied, vindicated, triumphant. Instead, I felt oddly empty. Tuesday afternoon, I was working out at Murphy's gym when Les approached me between sets. You look like someone who won a fight but lost something else, he said. What do you mean? I mean, you've got the expression of a guy who got exactly what he wanted and discovered it wasn't worth what he paid for it. I set down the weights and looked at myself in the mirror. Les was right. I looked successful, confident, in control. I also looked like someone I didn't entirely recognize. I proved my point, I said. What point was that? That she made the wrong choice, that her calculation was based on incomplete information. And now? Now she has to live with the consequences. Les nodded thoughtfully. And you? What do you have to live with? It was a good question. What did I have to live with? A successful revenge campaign that had cost me my relationship with my parents, my reputation in my professional network, and my sense of who I was as a person. I'd won decisively, but the victory felt hollow. "I have $6 million, I said. "That's not what I asked." I finished my workout and drove home through the city where I'd spent the last month systematically dismantling two people's lives, past the building where Cambria was probably packing to move somewhere cheaper, past the office where Troy was learning to run his company according to my requirements. My phone rang as I was parking in my apartment complex. Cambria's number. "Hello, Cambria." "I'm moving out of the loft," she said without preamble. "Troy's business is being restructured by his new investors. We're both starting over." "That sounds like a wise decision." "I know it was you, Orion. I know you orchestrated all of this. I can't prove it, but I know it. If you say so. I want you to know that you won. Whatever you were trying to prove, you proved it. I made a mistake when I left you, and now I'm paying for it. I'm sorry you're having difficulties." "Are you? Are you actually sorry, or are you satisfied that your plan worked exactly the way you wanted it to?" I thought about that question. Was I sorry? Sorry that she was struggling, sorry that her life had been disrupted, sorry that 4 years of shared history had ended with financial warfare instead of mutual respect. "I'm sorry it came to this," I said finally. "So am I." There was a long pause. For what it's worth, the man I fell in love with 4 years ago wouldn't have done this. He was better than this. The woman I fell in love with 4 years ago wouldn't have left me for someone with a nicer car. She was better than that. Maybe we both became people we don't like very much. After she hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot of my modest apartment complex and tried to figure out what came next. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to accomplish, but I hadn't thought much beyond the victory itself. I owned a successful consulting business, a commercial real estate portfolio, and enough liquid assets to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I also had no job, no relationship, no clear sense of purpose, and the growing suspicion that winning this particular game had cost me more than losing it would have. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your victory. Hope it was worth it." I deleted the message without responding and walked up to my apartment, where I spent the evening reviewing financial statements and quarterly reports from my new business interests. The numbers were all positive. Revenue was strong, expenses were controlled, and future projections looked excellent. Numbers didn't lie, just like I'd told Cambria. But they also didn't tell the whole truth. The truth was that I'd won a game I'd never wanted to play, against someone I'd once loved, using resources I'd never asked for. I'd proven that strategic thinking and superior information could overcome almost any disadvantage, but I'd also proven that some victories weren't worth the cost of achieving them. 3 months later, I sold my apartment and moved to a different city. I kept the business interests, but hired professional managers to handle the day-to-day operations. I used some of the inheritance money to start a nonprofit focused on financial literacy education, teaching people how to make better decisions about money and relationships. I never saw Cambria or Troy again, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that they'd both rebuilt their lives successfully. Cambria had started her own law practice specializing in family financial planning. Troy had learned to run his business conservatively and had apparently become quite good at it under the new management structure. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd called Cambria the day after I received the inheritance, if I'd told her about the money and given her the chance to reconsider her decision. Whether we could have worked through the hurt and disappointment and built something better together. But those were hypothetical questions about a different version of events, and I'd learned that dwelling on hypotheticals was less productive than focusing on the reality of choices made and consequences accepted. The reality was that Cambria had chosen to value financial security over emotional connection, and I'd chosen to prove that her calculation had been wrong. We'd both gotten exactly what we'd asked for, and we'd both learned that getting what you ask for isn't always the same thing as getting what you actually want. Numbers don't lie, but they don't tell you whether winning is worth the cost of victory either. That's a calculation you have to make for yourself, usually after it's too late to change the outcome. I'd made my calculation, and I'd have to live with the results, just like Cambria would have to live with hers. In the end, that was probably the only justice either of us deserved.